my persuasive speech today, I've decided to take a little bit of a different approach to it and do another topic that I'm very passionate about that has to do with basketball. It has to do with the amount of minutes that players play per game. In a basketball game, you have a regular 4 quarters of 12 minutes, which equates to 48 minutes. And then if needed, there are however many overtimes you need. So if you need 3 overtimes, that's another 15 minutes to the game, which would make it a 63-minute game. I'm sorry. With that being said, players playing in excess of 40 minutes per game is never a good thing because you're risking your players' health by doing so. Here's what I mean. Since the 1990s, players used to play a lot. They've been doing it in the 80s, the 90s. Even if you go before that, players were playing. A good example is Wilt Chamberlain. He would play in an entire season. He played 48 and a half minutes. Now think about that. In a whole game, there's 48 minutes. In a whole season, he averaged 48 and a half minutes, which basically means he's playing every game nonstop, no breaks. With the advancement of sports medicine and all, we've really seen an uptick in injuries that correlate with the amount of minutes that a player plays. Like I was saying, from the 80s and 90s, you had players playing a lot. In the early 2000s and mid-2000s, you had players playing way over 40 minutes per game. Some even averaging 40, 41, 42 minutes a game. And as we've gotten into the 2010s and 2020s, you've kind of seen that trend go down. It's because coaches are really embracing this new philosophy of keeping your players rested up for the playoffs. The best example of a player playing too much is Derrick Rose. Even if you're not a basketball fan, you most likely know who Derrick Rose is. He was the 2011 MVP of the whole league, becoming the youngest to ever do so. And his coach at the time, Tom Thibodeau, is a big user of his starters, which means he's playing his best starting 5 for as much as he can. He's not really going to go into his bench that much. By doing so, Derrick Rose was out there in a playoff game, which, in my opinion, I think they can use players more. And it's not so much that you can use players more in the playoffs, but you have to. Why do I say this? You need your best players in the playoffs, but you don't need your best players as much in the regular season. That's what coaches like Tom Thibodeau and Mike D'Antoni fail to realize. By overexerting your players, the lower body injuries add up. In the case of Derrick Rose, he was out there, and the Bulls were blowing out the 76ers. They had won the game. In the last minute or two of the game, Derrick Rose tears his knee up. He tears his ACL. And that has completely derailed his career for the worst. Has he had some good seasons since then? Yes. But we never really got to see a healthy and prime Derrick Rose play at the highest level because of how many minutes he was really playing at the time. Tom Thibodeau was also coach after the Bulls of the Minnesota Timberwolves. He was the coach of Jimmy Butler in Chicago, and then Jimmy Butler had been traded to the Chicago Bulls or the Minnesota Timberwolves for a season. And during the course of the season, as the season went on, with Jimmy Butler playing well over 37 minutes a game, he was more equipped to deal with injuries, or more likely to deal with injuries, as opposed to how he was, beforehand when his minutes were down. With the increase in minutes, right before the playoffs, Jimmy Butler has a knee injury that takes him out for a couple of weeks before the playoffs started, which was a big blow because the Timberwolves lost seeding in their games, and they then had to play the number 1 seeded Houston Rockets in the first round when they could have very well played the 3 seed or the 2 seed. A lot of what coaches need to realize is that minutes are not a thing that you mess with in the regular season. You want your players to be well rested for the playoffs. That is the most crucial piece of evidence that we have. There's a Bleacher Report article that was written, and it really it had a graph to even show you the studies that, with player injuries comes minutes. The minutes are up, player injuries are up. Minutes are down, your players have less likeliness to be injured. What we've come to understand, though, is that you can't expect your player to carry too much of a load in the regular season and then be full force in the playoffs. James Harden is the greatest example of this. For as much as he's played on the Houston Rockets, he tends to get more fatigued in the playoffs, which results in worse play. And who knows? He's never had a serious injury, but if he had kept up with these minutes and kept playing, well into his 30s, you may have seen another Kobe incident, who was also another victim of this, epidemic. Mike D'Antoni was the coach of the Lakers. He overplayed Kobe. Kobe ends up rupturing his Achilles, and he's never the same. We may have had a couple more years of Kobe at his greatest, as opposed to what we actually got, and he kind of started falling off in his mid-30s. My theory basically states that, as well as others, that coaches really need to embrace this philosophy full force and not overplay their players. Because in doing so, we as an audience, me as a basketball player as well, will be able to see my favorite players play well into their late 30s and maybe their early 40s. I think that would be great for the league. The league would probably benefit from this. And, player morale and player performance would definitely stay at an all-time high if this was